Order, please. This is meeting number 68. And as you can see on the orders of the day, we will be beginning with the Government Relations Institute of Canada, represented by Jim Patrick today, who is the President, and Mr. W. Scott Thurlow, the Chair of Legislative Affairs Committee. We'll be continuing our consideration of the Conflict of Interest Act. You have 10 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we'll move on to, for the rest of the hour, to questions and answers. So without any further delay, Mr. Patrick, you have the floor.
My name is Jim Patrick, Senior Vice President of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association and President of the Government Relations Institute of Canada this year. Joining me is Scott Thurlow, President and CEO of the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association and Chair of GRIC's Legislative Affairs Committee. We're pleased to be here today to speak to the committee's review of the Conflict of Interest Act. It was exactly 13 months ago we were here to speak to your review of the Lobbying Act. GRIC was founded in 1994 by government relations professionals in response to the growth and maturing of the industry over the past several decades. GRIC fostered high standards of practice through professional development and adherence to a professional code of conduct. We also speak on behalf of Canada's government relations community on matters pertaining to the relationship between the lobbying industry and government. Our membership includes consultant and in-house lobbyists from non-governmental organizations, universities, charities, national trade associations, crown corporations, and private companies, both domestic and multinational, extending across the breadth and depth of the Canadian economy. The Lobbying Act, by and large, governs activities of lobbyists. The Conflict of Interest Act, by and large, governs activities of public office holders. Given that much of the day-to-day activities of lobbyists and public office holders involves interaction between the two groups, it should be expected that the two statutes would intersect and overlap in key areas. This committee completed its 5-year review of the Lobbying Act in 2012. It will soon examine legislative amendments to the Lobbying Act stemming from that study. This committee's 2013 study of the Conflict of Interest Act therefore gives you an excellent opportunity to ensure that the two statutes are as aligned as possible and that existing gaps and overlaps between them do not work against the objectives of either statute. We have 3 principal recommendations. Specifically, first, the standard for determining whether a lobbyist has placed a public office holder in a conflict of interest should be the same as the standard for determining whether a public office holder was placed in a conflict of interest by a lobbyist. The rules on what types of gifts a lobbyist can offer a public office holder should be the same as the rules on what types of gifts a public office holder can accept from a lobbyist. And third, post-employment restrictions on public office holders should be streamlined. They should be administered and interpreted by a single authority, in our view, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner.
He told me not to touch the button. The standard for determining whether a lobbyist has placed a public office holder in a conflict of interest should be the same as the standard for determining whether or not a public office holder was placed in that conflict of interest by a lobbyist. GRIC notes for public office holders, the Conflict of Interest Act arguably sets the criteria and meaning for a real conflict of interest only. I say arguably because the committee has heard evidence that the test for apparent conflict of interest is implicit in the Act. The Lobbyist Code of Conduct, on the other hand, explicitly targets both real and apparent conflicts, creating a situation where the ethical bar could be seen as higher for lobbyists than public office holders, and a situation where lobbyists can be guilty of placing a public office holders in a conflict of interest that the public office holders were never actually in. As GRIC noted in its last appearance before this committee in February 2011, the Commissioner of Lobbying tabled a report in Parliament finding that a lobbyist had breached Rule 8 of the Lobbyist Code of Conduct and had therefore placed a public office holder in a conflict of interest. This ruling pertained to actions that took place in 2004, 5 years before the current rules were put in place. The retroactive application of the 2009 rules to 2004 events was never addressed or explained by the Office of the Commission of Lobbyists. Moreover, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner had already concluded, based on the exact same set of facts, that the actions in question did not constitute a conflict of interest or on the part of the public office holder. In other words, one officer of Parliament examined the facts and concluded that a public office holder was not in a conflict of interest, and then another officer of Parliament examined the exact same set of facts and concluded that a lobbyist had placed the public office holder in a conflict of interest, that the public office holder was apparently never really in. Logic, due process, and the fundamental tenets of natural justice dictate that once a public office holder is found by a quasi-judicial body not to have been in a conflict of interest, no individual can then reasonably be found by another quasi-judicial body to have placed that public office holder in a conflict of interest based on the same set of facts.
C'est pourquoi l'ERG.
For these reasons, GRIC recommended to the ethics in 2012 that the Commissioner of Lobbying standard for determining whether a lobbyist has placed a public office holder in a conflict of interest be consistent with Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner standard for determining whether a public office holder has been placed in a conflict of interest by a lobbyist. Whether the test is for real, apparent, or potential, it should be the same under both acts. Nobody should ever be found to have placed a public office holder in a conflict of interest that the public office holder was never in.
Pertains to what types of gifts a lobbyist can offer a public office holder. The Conflict of Interest Act defines gift or other advantage in Section 2.1 as an amount of money if there is no obligation to repay it, and a service or property or the use of property or money that is provided without charge or at less than commercial value. The Act further states that no public office holder or member of his or her family shall accept any gift or other advantage, including from a trust, that might reasonably be seen to have been given to influence the public office holder in the exercise of an official power, duty, or function. The Act further requires disclosure of any gift or gifts exceeding $200 from any one source in a 12-month period, and gifts over $1,000 are to be forfeited to the Crown. And as you know, in its guidelines on gifts, including invitations, fundraisers, and business lunches, Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner's Office has noted that it interprets the definition of gifts to include such things as money, loans, property, memberships, services, meals, invitations to events, invitations to galas, and to fundraisers. The guideline document goes on to explain that no specific rule exists as to which gifts can be accepted by public office holders. The value of a gift is not a criterion of acceptability. It is the threshold for the purpose of disclosure to the office and to the public.
On the statutory review of the Lobbying Act, this committee recommended that an amended Lobbying Act impose an explicit ban on the receipt of gifts from lobbyists. In its September 2012 response to this committee's report, the government committed to pursuing a prohibition on lobbyists giving gifts to public office holders and to rules specifying the value and nature of what types of gifts would be permitted and prohibited. As it is this committee that will review the upcoming changes to the Lobbying Act, which the government has signaled may include some additional restrictions on gifts from lobbyists to public office holders, you will have an opportunity as to ensure that the rules on what lobbyists can offer a public office holder are aligned with the rules on what a public office holder can accept from a lobbyist. GRIC takes no position whatsoever at this time on what definitions under the Lobbying Act should be when it comes to the value and the nature of the gifts that lobbyists can offer to public office holders. But we strongly recommend that you take the opportunity to ensure that the Conflict of Interest Act reflects the same definitions on the value and nature of and acceptability of gifts that public office holders can accept from lobbyists to avoid any confusion and conflict between the two statutes.
Principally, one major consideration you will have to address is the impact on charitable fundraisers and not-for-profit events if you, as MPs, are unable to accept, for any reason, tickets to any dinners or receptions that are the lifeblood of many important charities and foundations and organizations across the country, including in your own ridings.
Section 35 and 36 of the Conflict of Interest Act describe restrictions and prohibition on public office holders and separately on reporting public office holders. Generally, 1 or 2 year bans on dealings with former departments with which the public office holder had significant official dealings during a 1 or 2 period prior to his or her last day in office. In addition, the Lobbying Act creates a 5-year ban on former designated public office holders registering as a consultant lobbyist or an in-house organization lobbyist. Former designated public office holders may, however, register as an in-house corporate lobbyist, provided they self-determine that they lobby no more than 19% of the time. These multiple and overlapping definitions have already caused some confusion in the current examination of the Conflict of Interest Act, with some witnesses and members citing definition found in one act when meeting to cite definitions found under another one. It is the submission of our association that your review of the Lobbying Act, that you examine very closely the submission made by the Canadian Bar Association, which stated the CBA believes that post-employment restrictions on public office holders should be consistently applied and enforced. To this end, the CBA believes that to the greatest extent possible, post-employment restrictions on public office holders should be interpreted and administered by a single authority, i.e. the Commissioner of Lobbying or the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner.
Pour conclure, l'IRGC rappelle que
In conclusion, GRIC reiterates that by virtue of this committee's ongoing review of the Conflict of Interest Act and your upcoming review of legislative amendments to the Lobbying Act, you have an excellent opportunity to ensure that the two statutes work together and not at cross purposes. GRIC appreciates the opportunity to provide its views in this important proceeding and would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you. Thank you very much for your remarks. And we will now give the floor to Mr. Angus for 7 minutes.
Thank you for coming. I think we're certainly interested in the issues of the anomalies between the Conflict of Interest Act and the Lobbying Act. It doesn't seem to make any sense to have to be able to prosecute one side of the conversation, but not the other, depending on what the rules are. So, I'm interested in the issue under the Lobbying Code, which explicitly targets. It says real and apparent lobbying. It seems that we've heard at this committee in the past, and it's a principle of law that in order to be seen to be just, it must seem to be just. And yet, under the Conflict of Interest Act, it says it's just a real conflict that we're supposed to find implicit, that the apparent is implicit in the act. But I didn't know that implicit is a principle of law. It seems that if someone's being called out for a real conflict, there's a higher threshold than apparent. But it wouldn't be the same with lobbying. So would you suggest that we use real and apparent in both acts, or would you want the Lobbying Act to be loosened?
So I think the position that we would take first and foremost is that they should be the same.
The same.
And so whether you pick one or the other, that is the purview of this committee in what it does. And the second thing that I would say is that the common law has had more time since the creation of our country to discover, through the assistance of judges, what a real and apparent conflict of interest is. And I think that in making these types of determinations, we should turn to the common law as the best place to start. Well, that having been said, the Oliphant Commission has several recommendations in this direction. And I mean, our comment, I think, first and foremost, is that the standard for determining whether a lobbyist has placed the public office holder in a conflict of interest should be exactly the same as the standard for determining whether or not the public office holder in question was put in that conflict. I mean, from practical terms, whether the Lobbying Act or the Conflict of Interest Act applies explicit tests for real or apparent or potential of conflict of interest, the standard has to be the same.
Right. In terms of what surprised me when we were speaking with Ms. Dawson was, again, the focus on gifts down to $30, but she didn't really clarify a position on political fundraising, because we had the situation where the lobbying commissioner looked into the case, I believe Ms. Rate's case, and felt that this was inappropriate, selling tickets to a fundraiser. But Ms. Dawson didn't seem to find that because it wasn't for personal benefit. The issue of fundraising, I think, is really important to get our heads around. It's not to say that it would be perhaps impossible to say a lobbyist can't go to a fundraiser because a member of parliament or minister might not be aware of it, but would would selling tickets or holding the fundraiser would be different. How, from your experience in the industry, how do you think we could actually clarify the rules on fundraising so they are fair, but they're also ensuring that there's not undue influence?
I think you're absolutely correct. The Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying has held that fundraising activities for elected members are a personal benefit. In fact, activities that are conducted through her interpretation, rather, the office's interpretation of Rule 8 of the Lobbyist Code of Conduct is such that even a riding association is considered a personal benefit, almost property, your property. Whereas we've heard, as you rightly state, from the Commissioner of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, that it's not a personal interest. So if you're finding it confusing, I guarantee you everybody is. At this point, what we've said, we'll say what we said in the last time we were here before you, and that's the rules need to be clear. We don't have corporate and union fundraising in Canada. We've got funds that are donated by individuals, typically in small amounts. Those people, as much as you do, those people need to know that what they're doing is not going to prevent their chance to make a case to you in the future, that if they find themselves in another job that requires them, as part of their job, to talk to government, that they won't be prevented from doing that because 7 years ago they attended a fundraiser. It's the one area of the Lobbying Act, if any area is going to really be clarified and defined, it needs to be around political fundraising, and this is the opportunity, I would think, for this committee to do that.
Well, if at a later point you gentlemen have some thoughts on it, I think we'd be certainly interested in seeing it, because it is about being fair and just ensuring that we have clear rules so that, people aren't, there's no gotcha moments here, but for any side, we need to have a fair system. In light of that as well, I'd like to ask on the issue of gifts, because I think as MPs, we're probably obsessed from our point of view. I mean, on any given Saturday night, we have to go to 3 or 4 dinners people expect us to go to. It's not like we're getting a benefit from these dinners. It's part of our job. Are those $30 tickets for the dinner, is that a personal benefit we're receiving for doing our work if we start to list all that, or when, when the local organization comes and drops off the snow globe, or that we're having to actually price that? To me, that seems like a different issue than someone getting box tickets to a deputy minister who's picking a contract. So we could lower the threshold for gifts. We could say no gifts at all, pay your own way. That's one option. But it seems there's got to be a middle ground, that we clarify what a gift is and what would be seen as undue. You say you don't have a particular position. I thought that's what you said in terms of the value for dollar. But is there a way we could actually walk through this so that there's a little more clarity between someone dropping off, the NGO dropping off their gifts, and someone trying to really buy your influence?
Well, first of all, we think increased transparency is always good, in that an absolute prohibition isn't always necessary to achieve transparency. This committee recommended a complete ban on gifts to public office holders under the Lobbying Act, and the government agreed in its response, seemed to agree in its response to your report. Our primary concern is that needs to be handled very carefully, because the definition of gifts, although there is somewhat of a definition in the guideline documents that support the Act, extend to charitable fundraisers and gala dinners. I suppose on the basis that you, as elected members, might find yourselves politically compromised by attending the Canadian Women in Communications dinner, for example. It's coming up. That's why I thought of that. If there's going to be some level of prohibition on gifts that a lobbyist can offer a public office holder, then I think, first of all, that level should be the same as the level that triggers disclosure on your part. I think as much as we can sync up the rules on what can be given, what has to be disclosed or forfeited, that should be the same. And most importantly, it has to be at a level that you, as elected members, are comfortable with. I think the starting point for that discussion. And then we can give you a reaction, but I think the starting point has to be, are you, as elected members, comfortable with a lunch? Is a lunch going to influence you unduly? Is a dinner going to influence you unduly? Is a snow globe? I've been in your office. I've seen the box of snow globes. You still didn't agree with us on that issue, so I don't think a snow globe is where we need to draw the line.
Get me a bigger one next time.
Okay. Is it the value of a lunch? Is it a ticket to a fundraiser? Is it a ticket to a hockey game? I think that has to start with you yourselves. This is one of those rare opportunities where a parliamentary committee is examining rules that apply first and foremost to yourselves, rather than to common folk. And I think that's where that discussion has to start. Whatever the level is, we will advise our members to follow it. But any room between what a lobbyist can offer under the Lobbying Act and what an elected member can accept under the Conflict of Interest Act is just going to be a recipe for confusion. And again, think very carefully about the charities and the fundraisers in your ridings. Do you want to have to ask someone who invites you to come to the Kiwanis dinner if they're a lobbyist? Do you want to ask someone who says, we're having a United Way fundraiser, do you want to have to get a legal opinion on whether that person works for the United Way as a lobbyist because in their capacity as a United Way executive, they ask the government for a financial benefit. So now, in going to that dinner, in your riding, have you just accepted a gift from a lobbyist? We need clarity on all these things. But again, the first question needs to be, what are you comfortable with?
And if I could just add one quick thing to that, not all gifts have a pecuniary value that can easily be assigned to them. And so the opportunity to meet your childhood hero, which may not cost you a nickel, may be of more value to you than it might be to anyone else at this committee, for example.
Thank you.
Your time is up, and Ms. Davidson, you now have the floor for 7 minutes.
Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being with us this afternoon. I think that you've heard from the questions that we're getting today, and I'm sure that you've been following our study as we've been going through it, that I think the more we ask, the more confusing it becomes. So I appreciate your candor and your suggestions. One of the things that I always find is confusing are the definitions. Excuse me. And I think that when we look at the Lobbying Act and we looked at the Conflict of Interest Act, that we've got definitions in two pieces of legislation that mean different things. Could you comment on that, and in particular, like public office holder, reporting public office holder, designated public office holder? We sort of interchange those definitions back and forth. If you could comment on those as if you have any suggestions about how we could coordinate those. And another definition that I just don't know who can define it is influence unduly. We talk about that a whole lot. But who's going to define it? What do you take that definition to mean?
So I'll take a crack at the first question you asked, which is how do we get one definition out of three seemingly different definitions which appear in two acts that have at their core purpose different objectives. Okay, so the Lobbying Act is about governing the conduct of lobbyists, and the Conflict of Interest Act is to make sure that elected officials or just ordinary government servants, public servants, aren't putting themselves in a position where they may look like they are compromised. And I think that there's good reason for there to be confusion for the reasons that you just stated. So in this case, the Lobbying Act is actually a creature of criminal law, okay, whereas the Conflict of Interest Act is one about public service. And I don't think that you want to have confusion in a spot where an individual could be subject to a jail term or to a very significant fine. We are on the record many times, and one more time here today, that the post-employment rules should be consolidated under one officer of Parliament. Now, we provide it back to you as to which public office or which officer of Parliament that should be, as long as there's one definition. Okay, and we completely agree with you. And we think that it's appropriate that the officer of Parliament to interpret and administer the post-employment rules as long as it's one person making the interpretation. And the way that laws and definitions change is through the various public office holders interpreting those statutes through their decisions and their interpretations. And if there's only one body who is offering those interpretations, you won't see that definitional creep. Now, on Jim, did you want to talk about unduly influence?
Well, there's not much more I think I'll say than I've already said, that it's really up to you to decide what you feel unduly influences you. getting to know somebody, feeling comfortable with them enough to take their advice or to ask them a question on an issue, there's a level of influence there. But is it undue? I think that whatever the standard is, the committee needs to turn its mind to that in its report. And then as the process moves forward and the government responds and then tables the legislation to amend the Act, it's going to be a very key question. On behalf of 308 of your colleagues, you'll be setting the standard for what is acceptable to receive as gifts, what counts as an influence or an undue influence, and that'll last for another 5 or 6 years. We don't have a precise definition to put in front of you today. We talked to our members about it. We didn't have a consensus position in the end, but I hope you can come up with one because it's something that we'll all have to live with for a long time. So
it's safe to say then that you feel that we definitely should be putting that in the Act? The definition?
The more specificity that you can provide to the subsequent officers of Parliament and judges in interpreting the Act, the better.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about the post-employment issue, and you've addressed it. Both of you have spoken about it a bit. One of the things that you talked about was in the presentation, you're recommending that definitions be streamlined and consolidated under the Conflict of Interest Act, and that the sliding scale cooling off period for all categories of public office holder be strongly considered. I want you to tell me about the sliding scale, who you would apply that to, how you would apply it, and the rationale for that, please.
Well, sure. Yeah, we noted earlier recommendations from earlier witnesses that you should be examining a sliding scale based on the actual job that somebody had and how long they had it, instead of a one-size-fits-all cooling off period for everyone or a series of one-size cooling off periods for everyone. Right now, the same individual can be subject to a 1-year, a 2-year, and a 5-year cooling off period with respect to the department they work for, departments they dealt with significantly, and the entire federal government in some combinations. That's a lot of cooling off for the junior analyst from the Bureau of Weights and Measures. There are proposals on the table to apply the full cooling off period to everyone. We think that's probably gone too far. There are proposals to reduce it for everyone. We think that's probably going too far in the other direction. There's a lot of merit, I think, to tailoring the cooling off period to how long someone's been in the job and what the nature of their job actually was. We think that the appropriate vehicle to introduce that would be the Conflict of Interest Act. We think that the 5-year cooling off period in the Lobbying Act should be removed when you examine the legislative amendments to the Act that the government will bring forward to respond to last year's report. That 5-year cooling off period for designated public office holders should be removed and put into the Conflict of Interest Act. And that the concept of a sliding scale should be carefully examined by the committee to see if it couldn't be better tailored to the specifics of somebody's employment rather than trying to capture everybody with one or oftentimes a multitude of different tools. And the other thing that I guess we'd mention that goes to the concept of a cooling off period is the 20% rule. We mentioned that in our remarks, I believe. We're on record as saying you should eliminate the 20% rule as it applies to corporate in-house lobbyists. Right now, if I determine I lobby 20% of the time, I can't work for a trade association. I can't work for a consultant lobbying firm. But I can work for a publicly traded company as long as I self-determine that I only lobby 19% of the time. And I think that is meant as a guideline. It's been treated as a loophole. And again, I know I'm talking about the Lobbying Act here, but that'll be one of your next projects. We can't recommend strongly enough that loophole be closed.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Donc, on passe maintenant tout de suite à Monsieur Andrews.
Mr. Andrews, you now have the floor.
Here, sort of getting down to the brass tacks of where we're trying to go with this and try to get our heads around this. I'd like to carry on with just a couple questions from Patricia talking about post-employment restrictions and you suggesting that they be streamlined. How exactly do we streamline them? You just mentioned about taking the 5-year and putting it over the conflict of interest. How does that is that what you mean by streamline? Or how do we streamline the two? Because as we know, people could go to the conflict of interest commissioner and try to establish that they're not in a conflict, but then when they go off and do their work, they don't live up to what they told the conflict of interest, and then some of these public office holders don't even know that what they're doing is even lobbying.
That's right.
So help out one here how they would streamline it.
The answer is yes. I mean, the first thing is you start with one act. Okay, so you pick one, whether it's the Lobbying Act or the Conflict of Interest Act, and then you go from there. Then you take the existing menus of the various post-employment guidelines, and as parliamentarians, you ultimately decide what will apply to yourselves and what should apply to everyone else who works in the federal public service. I think that this committee will agree that if you are in a senior ranking position in a ministry, you're going to have a different standard in terms of the impact that you will make on a decision than you will if you're further down the pole in that same department. And I think the original post-employment guidelines that were administered under the Conflict of Interest Act recognize that difference. Okay, what we're saying is that creating a third sliding scale as it relates to designated public office holders under the Lobbying Act confounds that problem. And also acts as a barrier to post-employment for the individuals as they are promoted through the public service. And I think that's one area that hasn't gotten a lot of study, both by the public service and by Parliament, is the impact that the lobbying rules have had on individuals as they proceed through the public service. And there are probably people who have made a very difficult decision to take that next step and move up in the public service ranks, knowing that the impact will affect them after they leave the public service.
And what should the impact be? Like, is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? And then when you look at parliamentarians, we seem to be held to the top bar. And what are our employment chances afterwards when this all shakes out?
Well, I think yours will be very good. I think what you want to eliminate is the opportunity for regulatory comparison shopping. I had a young man come in my office one day looking to move out of government into the private sector. And I said, "But you worked for a minister within the last few years." "Yes, but I worked in the constituency office." So I asked the Conflict of Interest Commissioner if it's okay if I work for somewhere like the CWTA, and it would be, because I'd only not be able to go back to her department for a year. Well, what did the lobby commissioner say? Well, I haven't asked her because I got the answer I wanted from the conflict, and my father told me, when you're selling, stop selling. Stop selling once you've made the sale. We weren't hiring at the time, so it was a moot point, but it made me uncomfortable that one person could go shopping for the answer they want from different officers of Parliament based on the same set of facts. We've seen other cases, more publicized than that one, where designated public office holder, no question, they're a designated public office holder. Case I'm thinking of, the person worked for a party leader, but they weren't hired under a particular section of the Public Sector Employment Act. They were hired under Parliament, therefore the cooling off period didn't apply. Whereas other people in the office it may apply to. I'm not suggesting it was the right interpretation or the wrong interpretation, but it shows that there's room for different interpretations. I think the recommendation on the table from an earlier witness is a maximum 5 years. And from there you start looking at, okay, we're looking at somebody who was, the Minister for Weights and Measures. Maybe you say that minister had a very narrowly defined portfolio. Maybe that minister can't lobby the Bureau of Weights and Measures for 5 years. That I think most people would agree with. Now, if you turn complete other end of the cabinet table, Department of something that has nothing to do with weights and measures, well, maybe there's room there to say, okay, a 1 year across everything. However it's put together, it has to be consistent, and I think it needs to be clear, and it all needs to be done within the Conflict of Interest Act, not spread across 2 acts.
When you also look at the 20% rule, and then when you come to the 20% rule, and you guys are recommending just get rid of the 20% rule altogether, because some people, like I think you said, use it as a loophole. They can rejig it because it's self-reporting 20%, and even how they calculate the 20%. Oh, I'm not going to calculate my travel time and all this. It's very, very, very confusing. So. How is that so misunderstood? Why do they use it as a loophole? Just because they can?
Well, I think the reason it's misunderstood is because there hasn't been a lot of definition that's applied to it. I've written in the past that different people have taken different interpretations because it is incumbent on them to self-report. And I mean, 19% of your time means everything you did after breakfast on Monday, and that's it. Okay, but that's still 1 day a week when you effectively think about it. You're spending your time lobbying. I think that as you provide people, especially lawyers like myself, with tools to interpret statutes in a way that can benefit them, they will use it. Certainty of law is the most important thing that we can have in this regard, and I think it's very important to achieve that certainty.
And what do you folks think about the penalties? Because right now, someone could break both conflict of interest rule. There's no mandatory minimum. There's nothing that it's just a slap on the wrist from the commissioner, and they're not really impacted. It's a one-day news story, and it's not really a penalty.
I think you need to bear in mind that for a professional lobbyist, it's a one-day news story, but the reputation is someone who's had their name put on a report in Parliament. Okay, let me just take it from a lobbyist perspective to a business perspective. And you're a business person. You're in business, and it's about your own business or the company that you work for. Well, and you've got the two acts, and under one, you get a strongly worded letter from the Commissioner of Lobbying and your name put on a report in Parliament, and on the other, I think you're looking at $200,000 and
yeah, like the fines or jail time can be very significant
under the lobbying law.
Yeah, for violating that.
Should we have the same fines in that under the conflict of interest?
Again, my view would be as long as they're the same, that's the way to go, and just so that they are clear and predictable, and that there isn't an opportunity to leverage one act against the other to justify behavior.
Merci pour votre réponse.
Thank you for your response. And we'll now move on to Mr. Carmichael for 7 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses this afternoon. I want to talk about administrative perspectives on the Act, but before I do, I've got to go back to the value of gifts and some of your questions, because I'm not clear, and I hope we don't lose my full time on that issue. I'm sure we could. I don't collect snow globes, so I shoot those across to my colleague whenever I get one. So, yeah. The question is regarding, obviously, the size of gifts, and I know that in your opinion of these gifts, when you start talking about things like fundraisers, galas, etc., in reducing the value to zero, we eliminate it altogether. Is that standard across both acts from your perspective, and is that a fair and balanced approach to dealing with the issue?
Well, I'll talk about the Lobbying Act first. This committee recommended a complete ban. We haven't seen that come in. The government seemed to endorse that in its response, and I guess we'll wait to see the legislative amendments when they come forward. With respect to the Conflict of Interest Act, we noted the framework around gifts. There's the guidelines document and so forth. And there isn't an express prohibition. There's a requirement for disclosure and a requirement for forfeiture. There have been recent cases that we've been made aware of where the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner has strongly suggested that a number of chiefs of staff to ministers, for example, not attend an event because there was the perception that a meal would be served and therefore it was a gift. I think as part of the, it's probably not something you'd put in the Act, but as part of the downstream process, part of the creation of guideline documents that would support the Act, you're going to want to look at is a meal a gift? What if it's 2 courses, not 3 courses? I think you've all been to lots of gala fundraisers. And if you put those 2 acts together and in the course of that discussion you determine that, we should stay away from these things because there could be the perception of undue influence, and it's a lobbyist inviting me and, I don't want to be lobbied over dinner. Well, if you're comfortable with that being the standard, then we'll live by it. But I think you need to ask yourselves, we've all been to those dinners, and it's a pretty poor lobbyist who pulls a deck out halfway through a dinner and says, can I go through my top 10 issues with you? I mean, we all go to those for the same reasons you do, to eat the excellent chicken and listen to the excellent speeches, and then try to get home by 10 o'clock. I think by and large, the types of the activities that would be most harmed by a complete ban on gifts would be those activities that are the most benign. The charitable fundraisers and the types of gala events that we all go to support a cause, and this is the opportunity to put some clarity around that, because there is this a chill. There's a chill around these dinners around town, and I know some of our members are feeling it. And there are a lot of questions, and it'll be up to you to answer them.
So if I could add just one sentence.
Sure.
I would define two things. I would define the monetary value that is the threshold, and then I would define gifts, and make it a closed definition, not one that's open to interpretation.
Excellent. Thank you. So from an administrative perspective, while we have these legal minds in the room, when the Commissioner is asked to contemplate launching an investigation, there's potential for public and external factors to create a presumption of guilt prior to her conclusions being made known. Do you see any way that we can mitigate attacks on reputation for purely partisan purposes? And I think that's an important issue.
Yeah, we're sensitive to the Commissioner's concerns here, and I think anything that allows any officer of Parliament to ensure an accurate public record is worth considering. Right now, under the letter of the Act, MPs and Senators are prohibited from disclosing or publicizing requests for investigations on breaches of the Act by another MP or Senator. Perhaps that prohibition should extend to any individual or entity who requests an investigation to prevent what, I agree, it's becoming a trend. There's a request for an investigation, and it's inevitably accompanied by a press release announcing the fact that there's been a request for an investigation. And I would agree that that would put any officer of Parliament in an awkward position, and generally speaking could be seen to compromise the integrity of the process.
Indeed.
But I would add one sentence, and this is me speaking not on behalf of GRIC, but on behalf of myself more than anything else. There is an equally important competing obligation that an individual who is accused of something has the right to face their accuser. And this is not something that we have seen done in a way that is of satisfaction to many of our members, because they don't know where the accusation is coming from. And there has to be that balance.
Well, in fact, that was my second question. In the event that you have,
glad I could help.
Nicely done, nicely done. Where you have that situation where you've had a no fault found, if you like, how does the accused, in that case, have the chance to clear their name effectively? And it's in the public record, so you've got a situation that really creates a very difficult environment for that individual. Yeah. Is there any merit, from your perspective, in applying the Privacy Act to elements of the Office of the Commissioner? And we're thinking of things where the Commissioner is dealing with elements of conflict of interest. Specifically, is there a place where the Privacy Act should be more active?
I am notoriously pro-privacy, so I'll say yes, but I say that on behalf of myself, and this is not something that we surveyed our members about. But again, we're integrating yet another act into this, and so statutes like the criminal law obviously incorporate by reference definitions found in other acts. I would be very, very careful when you're contemplating that kind of a change to make sure that you have concordance in definition in between all of those acts.
Sounds like a lot of legal opinions coming through on that one when we get to it. How's my time?
20 seconds.
Sorry.
On passe maintenant à Monsieur Bouleris.
Mr. Bouleris, you now have the floor. 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our witnesses today. This is very, very interesting, and your remarks have been particularly enlightening. From the outset, I would say that what I learned quickly as an MP is that about 90% of the people I meet are actually lobbyists in the end. I mean, they're all asking for something. Some seniors want their post office boxes to be changed, others want the sidewalks fixed. I mean, so to an extent, yes, we have to clarify definitions, but actually our job is to listen to these demands. Now, we have the Conflict of Interest Act and we have the Lobbying Act. And it appears that the definitions vary between both legislations, but to define the same phenomena So it's almost like there are two pockets that you're reaching into for various rules that are quite different, but that have to apply to the same situations at times. And so sometimes one can feel quite schizophrenic in dealing with them. But there has to be more consistency, obviously, and I'd like you to give us some concrete examples of the fact that there is this confusion between the two, and if you could give us examples of the difference in interpreting them both.
The thing that I would tell you is that the senior in your riding who wants the sidewalk fixed, unless they're being paid by all the other seniors, is not a lobbyist. This is a constituent. I mean, and this is something actually that we've seen from other affiants or people who are testifying in front of this committee talking about what they describe as volunteer lobbying. I want to be really clear that in order to be subject to the Lobbying Act, you have to be paid. It is not it's not an act that's subject to the situation that you would describe in your opening remarks. I think the example that Jim spoke to in his presentation about someone who is shopping for a specific type of interpretation in advance of what they are seeking to accomplish is a good example of the conflict that's there. And from my perspective, right now, the two laws are bifurcated from one another in that you will be placed in a conflict of interest if X, Y, or Z happens, but a lobbyist will be deemed to put you in a conflict of interest when W, X, Y, and Z happens. And that should not be the case. It should be the one integrated provision. The other interesting issue under the Lobbying Act is the interpretation of what conflict of interest is. And there has been some questions about what political activities can raise a conflict of interest. And in your question, Mr. Angus, you asked specifically about political fundraising. Well, political activity that was the object of the problem with Rule 8 actually strikes at the very core of our fundamental charter rights when it comes to participating in the electoral process and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And so I would be very wary of treading into those areas for fear of constitutional ramifications on both your constitutional rights as a member of Parliament and the freedom of speech that would apply to you, but also the volunteers and the people who support you in your home constituencies. Because if they are helping you, whether it's putting in signs on lawns or helping to organize a fundraiser, that's their political right. That is their Section 3 right. And to then post facto prevent them from exercising their Section 6 right would be a problem.
You touched on this briefly earlier, this issue of a 20% loophole. I'd like to come back to that. I also think it's rather strange that people can sort of decide themselves on what percentage of the week they'll spend on lobbying and the rest, because that's hard to check. And lobbyists are not all equal. For example, there may be Mr. Mulroney or Mr. Chrétien, and they may deal with 1 or 2 phone calls a year. However, the effect could be much higher than, say, someone who's spending 100% of their time doing it. Now, if we take that 20% rule away, what would you suggest we replace it with?
On that is that approaching government and petitioning government is a right. It's not a privilege. I don't think any legislative measure should try to remove that right from people, or any bureaucratic decision within the public service should remove that right from people. In trying to shape the lobbying activities to conform with a legislative and regulatory framework, well, that's the prerogative of Parliament and its officers, and we recommend to our members that they follow all of that. Our recommendation to eliminate the 20% rule as it applies to corporate in-house lobbyists, I can tell you, is not a unanimous recommendation. We had a lot of our members come to us and say, "What are you guys, nuts? We're not going to be able, I've got friends who work for this company, they're not going to be able to keep their jobs, or so-and-so who is in government who wants to get out, I'd like to hire them and now I can't." We made that recommendation because we maintain that the rules should be the same for everyone and should apply equally to everyone. And if I'm coming out of a minister's office, I can't work at a trade association, I can't work for a consultant lobbying firm, but I can work for a corporation doing exactly the same work, as long as I determine it's 19% of the time. And as you rightly point out, that's just a recipe for confusion. And we understand it was meant as a guideline, but it's been treated as a loophole. So we wouldn't suggest that you reset that level to create another guideline, which could then be treated as a different kind of loophole.
And just if I could compliment what Jim's saying, first of all, he spends 2 phone calls, he gets what he needs done. But more importantly, the 20% rule, such as it is, isn't a rule. It's a guideline. And so because it comes from an officer of Parliament and is not embedded in statute it actually says significant portion of their duties. So it's what's your definition of significant? So I always go back to my original statement, which is the more specificity that can be found in the law, the better.
Merci. Donc, je cède.
Thank you. And the last question before our next hour is Mr. Calkins.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Thank you.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Thurlow, for coming today. I want to get back to the point that you made about the chill in the air, because I sense it as well. As a member of Parliament, I get invited every weekend to a number of events, some of which I can go to, some of which I can't, due to conflicts just in scheduling, whatever the case might be. On any given evening, I might be invited out to support some local charity, which is part of a larger organization. They'll ask, they'll say, and if I want to take my wife with me, it wouldn't be unheard of for me to spend $200 just on 2 tickets twice a week, every month. So I could be spending upwards of $1,000 just for the privilege of attending a political, not really a political event, but an event in my riding. I'm invited because I'm the MP. You know, we have certain things and privileges that we have with our members' operating budget. I don't really want to get into that. But we cannot use our members' operating budget to pay for any advertising or anything like that that is going to a third-party charity. So then, as an MP, you're on the hook for the entirety of the ticket if you choose to go. If you're not given an opportunity to go to one of these events and accept a free invitation for you and your spouse to go and attend this event, a lot of these organizations wouldn't have the presence of their members of Parliament because even though we're paid well, paying upwards of $600, $700, $800, $1,000 a month just for the privilege of going out and having a dinner with your fellow constituents does beg some questions. And as a member of Parliament, if we're not out here to meet people, whether they're a registered lobbyist or not, whether they've a person with an issue, virtually everybody comes to you with, and the word from a long time ago is their petitions. They want to have access to their member of Parliament. They want to talk to their member of Parliament. They want to engage their member of Parliament, and every member of Parliament should rightfully want that in return. What I sense now with all of the, I'll call it ankle biting and nipping at the heels, for example, of various, whether it's allegations, whatever, chasing something down, trying to tarnish the reputation of somebody. We've got access to information requests. We've got people's names bandied about with quite loosely, with allegations coming forward that they may or may not have done something, but the optics of a story can do all the damage that needs to be done. From the perspective of a lobbyist, it's been very clear that the act of lobbying is quite necessary and quite productive in the use of constructive dialogue and building a government that responds to the needs of its people. Member organizations of your companies work, they have jobs, they raise families, they do the things that they need to do in order to be successful. Not every lobbyist comes with simply the intentions of furthering the own personal ambitions. They're there to further advance the development of industries which support the backbone of our country. So I want you to just help me explain to the Commissioner or to make recommendations here about what some of the effects of clamping down too much on these types of on certain types of what are considered to be, I would think, would be normal practices in engaging the political process, and putting a chill in those, because I'm actually quite concerned about that.
Well, I think your question is very very appropriate. We've heard already about organizations who are telling us this is our last year we're having this dinner, and we've had it for 14 years because we just can't get people to buy tables because they can't buy tables because they don't think they can invite the people who work in government that they want to invite. That's why we do this dinner in Ottawa instead of in Toronto or Montreal. I think if there is going to be some level of prohibition on gifts, and this committee recommended a prohibition on gifts from lobbyists, the government responded in a way to suggest they may be able to define gifts in a certain way to accommodate what I'd call gifts that are within the bounds of normal professional protocol. We haven't consulted our members on whether that's a $100 ticket or a $200 ticket, whether it's one a month or two a month, but you will need to do that. You'll need to have that go through that exercise, I would suggest, either together or individually, as to what you're comfortable with. What do you feel is an attempt to unduly influence you versus an attempt to invite you to an event out of normal courtesy and protocol?
I would add there is another officer of Parliament that you can consult, and that would be the Chief Electoral Officer. The Chief Electoral Officer has dealt with this issue very specifically in the value that you, as Blaine Calkins, as the member of the committee, would receive by attending that event, the cost of the chicken, the cost of the lettuce, the cost of the plates, and then everything else would be deemed a political contribution. So there is some insight that you could gain from that about what would be an acceptable threshold or not. But ultimately, as far as we're concerned, there is an effect. And it's an effect that is going to have an adverse impact on the ability of charities, the ability of individual community organizations, separate and apart from the wing inside Ottawa, to sustain themselves. And I'd be very, very concerned about it.
Thank you once again for coming. Our time is up now for the first half of our meeting, and we'll suspend for a few minutes to give you time to leave. Thank you once again, and we'll come back in 2 minutes. Order, please. We will now start the second half of our meeting with the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying. We have with us today the Commissioner herself, Ms. Shepherd, who is the Commissioner of Lobbying, and Mr. Bergen, Senior Counsel. Once again, we are considering the Conflict of Interest Act. You have 10 minutes to make your opening remarks, and then we'll move on to questions from members. Ms. Shepherd, you have the floor for 10 minutes, and thank you for coming. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the legislative review of the Conflict of Interest Act. I am accompanied by Mr. Bruce Bergen, Senior Counsel. As the Commissioner of Lobbying, my role is to administer the Lobbying Act and the Lobbyists' Code of Conduct.
Requirements for lobbyists who are communicating with government decision makers and is intended to ensure transparency in lobbying activities. The Conflict of Interest Act applies to government decision makers and establishes a framework for preventing conflict of interest from arising. In this way, the two pieces of legislation are complementary. Today, I would like to share with you my perspective on matters where the two statutes may deal with related topics, such as the definition of public office holders, the treatment of post-employment periods for public office holders, and the interpretation of conflict of interest. The
first point I would like to make is that the definition of public office holder is different in the two pieces of legislation, that is, reporting public office holder versus designated public officer. In addition, each Act provides for a subcategory of public office holders to which particular requirements apply. Reporting public office holder in the Conflict of Interest Act and designated public office holder under the Lobbying Act. Several public office holders are captured by both subcategories, including ministers, ministers of state, parliamentary secretaries, and ministerial staff. Governor and council appointees are considered reporting public office holders under the Conflict of Interest Act. However, with the exception of deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers in government departments, who are not designated public office holders under the Lobbying Act. In addition, the Lobbying Act considers certain public servants as designated public office holders, such as assistant deputy ministers, while the Conflict of Interest Act does not apply to them. All members of the House of Commons and senators have been identified as designated public office holders, but the Conflict of Interest Act does not apply to them unless they are ministers, ministers of state, or parliamentary secretaries.
Who is covered by each piece of legislation are a source of confusion for public office holders. This is especially true when it comes to determining which post-employment prohibitions one is subject to. Under the Conflict of Interest Act, reporting public office holders are subject to a 1- or 2-year prohibition on certain activities, which may include lobbying activities. The Lobbying Act prohibits designated public office holders from working as lobbyists, except under certain circumstances for a period of 5 years. This can be confusing for individuals who are subject to both acts. It is essential to make it clear to former public office holders that there are two different post-employment regimes, so they do not find themselves in breach of one of them. I have worked with Commissioner Dawson's office to avoid this confusion. For example, a reference to the post-employment prohibitions that apply to former designated public office holders in the Lobbying Act are now added to letters sent by Commissioner Dawson to former members of Parliament when they leave office. I believe this will help alleviate some of the confusion between the post-employment restrictions contained in each statute. Je crois savoir que la commissaire Dawson.
I understand that Commissioner Dawson is recommending that the definition of reporting public office holder exclude interns and summer students who are ministerial staff for terms of less than 6 months. It is my understanding that this would mean that interns and summer students would not be subject to the 1-year post-employment period currently in place under the Conflict of Interest Act.
Working as ministerial staff, if hired under the Public Service Employment Act, are subject to the 5-year prohibition on lobbying activities contained in the Lobbying Act. The Lobbying Act gives me the power to grant an exemption from the prohibition to former designated public office holders if it would not be contrary to the purposes of the Act. I have taken a strict view of the Act, and I have granted 9 exemptions out of the 21 applications from former designated public office holders that I have completed to date. One of the grounds provided by the Act for granting an exemption is that an individual was employed under a program of student employment. 3 of the 9 exemptions I granted since July 2008 were granted to individuals on the basis that they were employed through a student employment program. In my opinion, Parliament may wish to consider the application of the post-employment prohibitions in both the Lobbying Act and the Conflict of Interest Act to individuals employed under a program of student employment. As I mentioned earlier, I am also responsible for administering the Lobbyist Code of Conduct. The Code has been in place since 1997. Its purpose is to ensure that lobbying activities are conducted at the highest ethical level. The Code is comprised of 3 principles and 8 rules. Rule 8 of the Code deals with improper influence and conflict of interest. This rule prohibits lobbyists from placing public office holders in a situation that would create a conflict of interest. In a judgment issued in March 2009, the Federal Court of Appeal offered clear direction regarding how the question of conflict of interest should be interpreted. My interpretation of what constitutes a conflict of interest and the guidance that I have provided to lobbyists flows from this decision. For a lobbyist, Rule 8 of the Code is about avoiding placing public office holders in a situation that creates either a real or apparent conflict of interest. Un conflit d'intérêt peut survenir.
A conflict of interest may arise when a lobbyist offers a gift or anything of value to a public office holder while lobbying this same public office holder or his organization. My experience in enforcing Rule 8 of the Code is that lobbyists generally seek to avoid placing public office holders in a real or apparent conflict of interest. Commissioner Dawson recommends that the current threshold of $200 for requiring public declarations of gifts received be lowered to a value of $30. This recommendation will improve transparency in terms of the gifts that public office holders are receiving from lobbyists. In my view, however, the monetary value of a gift is not the most important test of whether that gift is acceptable, particularly those gifts given by lobbyists to public office holders. The test for acceptability requires a consideration of whether the giving of a gift could reasonably be seen to influence the public office holder's decisions to the detriment of the public interest.
Tabled 2 reports on investigation in Parliament on the lobbying activities of Michael McSweeney and Will Stewart, in which I found the lobbyists in breach of Rule 8 for having placed a minister in an apparent conflict of interest. They did so by helping to organize and sell tickets for a fundraising event for the Minister's Electoral District Association. These lobbyists were, at the same time, lobbying the minister. Although they were properly registered, I concluded that the actions of the lobbyist created a reasonable apprehension that the minister had been placed in what appeared to be a conflict of interest. In reviewing the same situation in relation to Michael McSweeney, Commissioner Dawson, in her report under the Conflict of Interest Act, concluded that Minister Raitt had not taken any action that created a conflict of interest. However, she noted in her report that she was concerned that should a situation arise where the minister had to make an official decision involving the lobbyist, she could be subject to allegations of preferential treatment because of his work on the fundraiser. As mentioned in my reports on investigation, I believe that raising funds for the Minister's Riding Association advanced the private interest of this minister by helping in getting her re-elected as a Member of Parliament. In my opinion, private interest is not limited to financial interest or to an interest which generates a direct personal benefit. In my view, it is broader and includes such things as political advantage and family interests, if those interests could reasonably be considered to create a tension between the public office holder's public duty and his or her private interests.
In summary, I believe that the Conflict of Interest Act and the Lobbying Act are key to achieving greater ethical behavior with the ultimate objective of enhancing the trust of Canadians in government's decision-making. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my remarks, and I am now pleased to answer any questions you or the committee members may have. Thank you very much. And we'll start with Mr. Angus for 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
For coming here and, as always, giving us a very clear and concise interpretation of your work. I'd like to put this review and the review that we had of the Lobbying Act in context. We felt that rules needed to be tightened because of a widespread disgust in Canadian politics about big money unduly influencing politicians. And rules were brought in and standards were set. And now sometimes we might chafe against some of those rules because they sometimes seem a little arbitrary, but the reason those rules were put in there was to stop the backroom influence that was plaguing Ottawa. And so I look at your reports and I'm really impressed with the clarity of it. In fact, on the issue in the rule, the reports on Michael McSweeney and Will Stewart, so that you found they were in breach of Rule 8 for placing the minister in an apparent conflict of interest, but it was because they were helping to organize and sell the tickets to a fundraiser. I mean, they were playing an active role. And in your act, it's the issue is real and apparent seem to have perhaps as equal weight. I don't know equal weight, but there's a clear weight there. Under the review we're doing, we're not getting a clear sense from the Commission we've spoken to her whether she sees fundraising as a personal benefit or not. You've said it clearly is. Do you think if we had the rules real, the clarity in the language real and apparent in both acts, that it would help to alleviate any possible conflict of interpretation between your office and Ms. Dawson's?
Well, in terms of the definition for conflict of interest, it actually is in the Lobbyist Code of Conduct refers to, there are 3 rules that deal with conflict of interest. The court case that I referred to in my opening remarks, which provided the clear directions that it's not just looking at a real conflict of interest, but also an apparent conflict of interest, because just to look at a real conflict of interest would be to say that other conflicts are acceptable. And when I look at, other definitions even of private interest, for example, I mean, using a broader definition is consistent with actually the OECD definition as well.
Right. And I guess the issue in terms of apparent is that the line could be used, and it was used with Mr. Jaffar's case and Bruce Carson. Well, they weren't successful in lobbying, so there wasn't a problem, as though the only way you could have a real conflict is if they actually were successful. But it's the issue of stopping that lobbying, of the importance of public office holders knowing that there's a line that has to be maintained. And again, 95% of the lobbyists are going to follow the rules, but it's for the ones who aren't following the rules that we have to make sure. How important is that apparent word in terms of keeping a line very clearly drawn?
In terms of just, I don't know if a small correction, Mr. President, in terms of like with Rahim Jaffer and so on, it wasn't about conflict of interest. The issue was that the individual had not registered.
As a lobbyist, yes.
You're correct
yes.
yeah, as a lobbyist. So you're correct in that it's not whether the undertaking is successful or not. It's the actual activity of communicating on a registrable activity that requires registration.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to clarify, because I mean, I've heard it said, well, they weren't successful, so what's the problem? But the issue is that if we have a clear line about that apparent conflict, that people know what that means, so that there's no ambiguity there, that's what we're trying to weed out. I'd like to ask you, we've had many questions going back and forth whether or not going to your local Heart and Stroke Foundation dinner as a member of Parliament is the same as receiving a gift from a lobbyist who's trying to influence you, and whether as members of Parliament we are getting ourselves caught up into a morass here. Under the Lobbying Act, the public office holder is defined as a member of the Senate or the House of Commons or any person on the staff of such member. Under the Conflict of Interest Act, public office holder is Minister of the Crown, member of ministerial staff, ministerial advisor, government and council appointee. It doesn't seem to have the exact same definition. Am I reading that correctly? That under the conflict of interest, we're not seeing members of Parliament, although there is a code of conflict of interest for members of Parliament. So I think all of us are trying to figure out, okay, what's the difference in our role as ordinary members of Parliament in receiving gifts, first of all, from community organizations? Is that under the Act? And is there a distinction between how we are defined under the Lobbying Act and under the Conflict of Interest Act?
Well, under the Conflict of Interest Act, as I understand it, with the exceptions of ministers of states, and parliamentary secretary, they're considered to be reporting officers under the Conflict of Interest Act, where, as you say, a normal member of Parliament would not be a reporting officer. So that's where the confusion comes, because in the Lobbying Act, members of Parliament, whether you are a minister or just an MP, you are a designated public office holder. Right. In terms of the issue of gifts, I don't look at the gifts in terms of what the public office holder is receiving. What I'm looking at is my responsibility and mandate is to look at what's happening vis-a-vis the lobbyist. Yeah. So is it the lobbyist in giving a gift to the public office holder, creating an apparent or a real conflict of interest?
Right. I guess that it's just something we're trying to clarify, because clearly under the Lobbying Act, you're dealing with lobbyists giving gifts, and they're doing this because they're hoping to influence. It could be okay. It might not be okay. You're interpreting that. We're trying to define it under the Conflict of Interest Act, because you have the reporting office holders. We have public office holders, which is a slightly different definition, but it's not really clear what exactly an ordinary member of Parliament is supposed to report, because we see a real clear set of rules in terms of conflict of interest with ministers and parliamentary secretaries. Do we need to define that language a little clearer so there is no ambiguity?
Well, my experience in administering the Lobbying Act is that it's always better to have rules being clearly spelt out, because then it's easier to understand what you need to do in terms of following something.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Butt, you have the floor for 7 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and Ms. Shepherd and Mr. Bergen, thank you very much both for being here. I mean, one of the reasons we are here today is because the government did have the foresight to bring in a number of pieces of legislation to provide better accountability and transparency through the Conflict of Interest Act and through the Lobbyist Act and the subsequent codes that are there. So I think it's after 5 years later, I think it's very appropriate for us to be here and be reviewing this and getting some expert testimony, not only from you and other commissioners on this, but from our previous witnesses who were here, who are, in the trenches day in, day out, and they're asking for the same thing too, which is they want to know what the specific rules are. They're not interested in breaching rules either. They want to know what the clear rules are. And I think one of the things we have said is that lobbying and interaction with members of Parliament and with cabinet ministers and other public office holders is a proper part of the job we all do here. Whether it's the constituent that calls you about a mailbox, or whether it is a lobbyist for a major company that does a significant amount of business in your riding, for them to have interaction with me as a member of Parliament is a legitimate part of them doing their job. It's also a legitimate part of me doing my job by listening to what the issues are and what they have to say. So one of the concerns that I have is that there seems to be a disconnect between the two pieces of legislation and between the two commissioners' offices. Not because you folks aren't doing your jobs, you are interpreting your different acts the way they are. But I think it would be better for everyone if we had one set of clear rules, clearer definitions. So what are some of the specific things that we could do to have both your office and the Office of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner and the two pieces of legislation do a better job of speaking the same language to the same people? You've mentioned a few of the differences, whether we call it designated public office holder in one act and we call it reporting something in some other act. I mean, have you got any specific recommendations that we can look at to say, look, how do we get these two pieces of legislation to say the same thing, generally to the same people that are being covered under these two pieces of legislation?
Well, the definition of which officers or who you want to cover, Parliament decides to cover in terms of either reporting, using the reporting public office holder definition or the designated public office holder. The other issue that's different in both legislations is the time period for post-employment. The third issue is the activities that are covered. And the Conflict of Interest Act refers to representations. Well, some of these representations may in fact be lobbying. What might be of interest to the committee is that some of these representations might in fact, yes, be lobbying, but if it's, I think under the Conflict of Interest Act, it doesn't matter whether you're paid or unpaid in that year or 2 year period. Under the Lobbying Act, I would only be looking, it's only considered a registrable lobbying activity, and the 5-year prohibition only applies then if it's paid lobbying. So actually where it may not be acceptable, during that first year to do lobbying if it's unpaid under the Conflict of Interest Act, under the Lobbying Act, that would not be something that fits the prohibition.
Do you draw any differences in lobbying between government members that are being lobbied or cabinet ministers versus members of the opposition? I mean, we certainly know that lobbyists meet with all 308 members of Parliament if they're able to get access to all of us, and senators for that matter, I'm sure. Is there any distinction between whether or not you are, as far as what the lobbyist is required to do and how the conflict of interest rules are established between someone going and meeting with a cabinet minister, a parliamentary secretary, a government member of Parliament, or an opposition member of Parliament? Are the rules different, or is it the same for everyone?
It's the same rules for everyone. The only difference with maybe looking at whether the conflict of interest situation is if an individual was a minister, then as per that court case, which actually, dealt with not only lobbying the minister, but the department in question. So that's where, I would be looking at the conflict even bigger depending on what the lobbying was doing. But in terms of the rules are the same, that if they are communicating, if they are paid and communicating on registrable activities, and for in-house organizations and corporations, there's the additional test of the significant part of duties, the 20% as it's been interpreted, and that if the meetings are organized with a designated public office holder, which all members of Parliament are, no matter whether you're part of the government, a minister, or the opposition MP, then those encounters have to be registered unless it's the designated public office holder that invites the lobbyist to come in and do a presentation.
Do we need to clarify the definitions of conflict of interest? I mean, versus, apparent versus perceived. I remember when I used to serve as a member of the Mississauga Committee of Adjustment, which was a small zoning body. We dealt with very small zoning issues in Mississauga. And I remember when I was first appointed to that as a volunteer citizen member, I had to sign a declaration, and we were always read the Riot Act on the pecuniary conflict of interest, and whether we had a pecuniary, which really meant financial. Would you financially benefit personally because you participated in the debate even the debate on an application, because maybe it was your next door neighbor wanted to build an illegal swimming pool and it would affect your property value, or you worked for a company and a subsidiary company was involved in, had an application before the committee. And I quite often declared a conflict of interest at the beginning of the meeting and excused myself from the room. I did not participate. Are our rules in the federal legislation that strong to give those proper definitions of where there could be direct financial benefit, or is that something that we as a committee through this review need to be looking at these definitions to make sure that they are very, very clear? Because I think there's a different story between an inadvertent conflict of interest, you meant no harm, I mean, you weren't totally aware, versus obviously something where you stand to benefit as a designated public office holder or anyone else covered under the legislation in obviously a direct financial impact where you or a family member would directly benefit. So have we got the definitions right so far, or do we need, is there more work we need to do in setting those definitions?
Well, in terms of, as I was saying earlier, for the conflict of interest, where it comes into like the Lobbying Act, where I am drawn is with the Lobbyist Code of Conduct. And the court has provided me sort of with the clear direction of the fact that I must look at both apparent and real conflict. I think in looking to answer your question on, is the definition in the Conflict of Interest Act, sufficient or right, is when when I look at the two pieces of legislation, I think I said this in my opening remarks, is the reason we have these definitions is for Canadians to have, more confidence in the integrity of government decision making. So this is, should the definition include then an apparent conflict of interest as opposed to just real conflict, I think is something Parliament does want to address.
Thank you. And Mr. Andrews, you now have the floor for 7 minutes.
And welcome back, Commissioner Shepherd. It's good to see you again. Our last witnesses that were here and some others that have come in have talked about streamlining the two, streamlining the conflict of interest, streamlining the lobbying, making sure that it's the same under both acts, so there's less confusion. And I noticed you also talked about which public office holders it applies to and the terming in that. Is that the only streamlining we need to do? Do you agree with streamlining the two and maybe have just one commissioner responsible?
Well, when I look at the history of the legislation, I mean, the individual, there was an individual at one point that was responsible for both the Lobbyist Code of Conduct and for the code for members under the Conflict of Interest Act. And there were, I guess, there was a court case on a few cases, and the issue was the fact that it was their bias, because no one was being found to be guilty on either the public office holder side or a breach or the lobbyist side. So I think there is a reason to have the two sides separate. That said, I think and I said this in my opening remarks, if there's something looking at putting the post-employment under either the Commissioner Dawson or the lobbying, would be that certain things do need to be harmonized, because the reporting definition, the officers covered in terms of the reporting officer and the designated public office holder, the definitions don't cover the same number of people. The post-employment, the times are different, and so are the activities covered under post-employment.
And so are the fines.
Yes.
And that was sort of my next question, because there is no fine structure under the conflict of interest, but you do have some power to fine.
Actually, no. In terms of, I think Commissioner Dawson has ability to fine under certain situations. Under the Lobbying Act, if I have reasonable grounds to believe that the act has been breached, then I have to refer it to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It's only at that point with the prosecutor's office that fines or jail terms can be issued.
Okay.
What's at my disposal is tabling a report to Parliament.
Should those be harmonized as well?
It would, I guess, Mr. President, it's a good question. It's very much whether, I think that if you're putting them under the thing together, then there might be some rationale, but it's sort of what is Parliament trying to achieve? I think it's more, when I was looking for, before the committee under the Lobbying Act review, and I talked about receiving administrative monetary penalties, it was to look at having them as a detriment for other lobbyists or more of a corrective action. And I think that would be the consideration as to why would you be giving fines to either commissioner, let alone harmonizing them.
Well, and that leads me to my next question. We've got the case of Loyal Sullivan, and he's been found guilty under the Conflict of Interest Act. No retribution, nothing. He's just been wrote up. Where is that in your office now with his lobbying activities?
Well, as you know, I do conduct my reviews in private, but as this is in the public domain, as I've done previously with the committee, I will confirm that I am looking into the matter. It is a priority for my office. In terms of timing, I can't give any further details at this point.
Okay. We've also heard about the 20% rule, and how people, it's sort of self-administered. And how do you test that? How do you test whether someone's being truthful with the 20% rule? And do you think there's a lot of people hiding behind the 20% rule?
Well, my experience is that lobbyists do want to comply with the Act. I mean, I think the calls that we receive in the office trying to understand things such as the continuing part of duties and the 20% threshold would indicate that there are more than 5,000 lobbyists registered. In terms of how we go about checking, the onus is on the lobbyist. If I have reason to believe that, somebody is not complying with the legislation, then I will, conduct an administrative review, which is my fact-finding exercise, which will allow me to determine whether I need to open an investigation. But, in looking at the percentage, there is an interpretation bulletin out there that, I look at, how much time they're actually spending preparing for the meetings. I actually, in the bulletin I refer to.
Can you make that judgment if you're doing an investigation, that they provide the information to you and you will decide that they're above the 20%?
Well, when actually the report that I tabled to Parliament on Green Power Generation Corporation was one where I determined, this was an in-house corporation, that they had passed a significant amount of duties test and should have registered.
Okay. The sliding scale. We've heard about a sliding scale for the different public office holders. Is that something we should look at for both the conflict of interest and the lobbying?
Well, when I look at why there was a post-employment provision put in for the Lobbying Act, it was to prohibit, designated public office holders from using any contacts or knowledge or in their decision-making authority for the benefit of lobbying for 5 years. That said, my experience, as being a public office holder and in the exemption review requests that I have received, I think clearly show that, there are different decision-making authorities. The contacts are different based on the different positions, the length of the individual is actually sitting in the position. So I think there is something that Parliament may want to look at. I mean, interns and students are a perfect example of that.
Yeah. So that sort of falls into the sliding scale. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
See, Ms. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. Mr. Drishin, you now have the floor for 7 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here today. Just a couple of things, and Scott had mentioned them before. This concept of, some of the difficulties that you have, again, trying to match the two codes and everything. Was, as many of us are taking a look at the conflict of interest, Commissioner's role as well as your own. And one of the things that that we heard in the last session by the folks from GRIC is that they had talked about a situation. I'll just kind of go through part of what is here, and maybe you can then comment on it. They were stating that in February 2011, the Commissioner of Lobbying tabled a report in Parliament finding that a lobbyist had breached Rule 8 of the Lobbyist Code of Conduct and therefore placed a public office holder in a conflict of interest. This ruling pertained to actions that took place in 2004, 5 years before the current rules were put in place. And so they speak of that. And then they said, moreover, the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner had already concluded, based on the exact same set of facts, that the actions and questions did not constitute a conflict of interest on part of the public office holder. So therein lies the dilemma. And, so people are looking at these two different sets of rules, and they're trying to determine how each one of you are looking at those facts, if indeed they were the same set of facts. So just wondering if you could enlighten us somewhat on that, so that we get a picture of what they were trying to say from your perspective.
First, I would like to correct, I guess, for the record, there was no activities in the case that I believe that they're referring to in March 2004.
Okay.
The activities actually occurred in September of 2009. Which was after the court ruling came out in March of 2009, which dealt with the issue of, actually it was fundraising, and that's where the issue of conflict of interest came in. And as I've mentioned, it brought in that whole tension or obligation being created between the private interest and the public office holder's duty to serve the public good. It also provided me with the direction, a clear direction in terms of looking at conflict of interest, and that it should include not only just the real conflict of interest, but the apparent conflict of interest. And as I indicated in my opening, I think, remarks, I mean, as I understand it too, when Commissioner Dawson looked at the same situation in terms of vis-a-vis the minister, she was looking at whether the minister had, I believe, received a gift. And she determined that the minister had not received a gift. But as I indicated in my reports for both on Michael McSweeney and on Will Stewart, as was mentioned earlier in the committee, that they had actively worked on a fundraising campaign by selling tickets at the same time that they were lobbying the minister and her department. So that decision actually is quite consistent with the direction that the court case had provided me. So.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. You also talked about the OECD, the context of conflict of interest as well in your comments.
I think I was talking about private. It's when they define private interest, it's a broader definition in terms of looking at private interest than strictly looking at it as the individual receiving a direct financial benefit. It includes a much broader range, which I think is consistent with looking at an apparent conflict of interest, not just a real conflict. That's something, Monsieur le Président, that if the committee would like, I can actually send the definition to the committee after the appearance.
Okay. Now, going to the 20% rule, and again, this is some of the discussions that we've had in the past, but the amount of time that a person is preparing for a meeting, travel time, that you might have if you're coming from Western Canada here to Ottawa in order to do lobbying. I mean, these are things as well that we've talked about in the past. Have you been able to, with the folks in your office, been able to come up with any new ideas about how that should be addressed when you're trying to look at the percentage of time that an individual lobbyist is actually engaged?
Well, in terms of, I think, the guidance, it's been quite clear, and it's sort of the reason I sort of had travel is because there are some companies that actually will put somebody in Ottawa so that they can have easier face time, whereas somebody deciding it's important to have the president, to make it a significant thing to fly them across the country for a particular meeting. I am looking at whether I can see if that guidance can be even any clearer in terms of the lobbyists, but I mean, it is clear in the bulletin that if the individual determines that it's significant for an individual to be there, or it's significant for them, then they should be looking at registering. As I always say, lobbying is a legitimate activity, and if you're ever not sure, then err on the side of caution and register is my advice.
With look at other countries and the types of things that they are doing, and I know that you've had opportunity to go to different areas and to present on behalf of Canada and hear other things that are happening. I wonder if you could comment on any comparisons that you see, any kind of discrepancies that there might be between what we use for lobbying as our rules and what you might see in other countries.
Well, what I have found in my experience of talking about the Lobbying Act is Canada is considered to have quite a robust regime model when it comes to lobbying, in fact, in terms of even with designated public office holders, now reporting on a monthly basis, if it's oral and arranged. Where I think some of my experiences has shown when I was, in the United States, when they're looking at the 20% rule, it actually applies to consultant lobbyists. I think when we're looking at why we have lobbying legislation and transparency, I think actually it makes sense that there is no 20% rule in Canada as it applies to consultant lobbyists.
Okay. How much time do I have?
30 secondes.
30 seconds.
That's
30 seconds.
Donc, je vais céder la parole à Madame.
Thank you, and Madame Borg, you now have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank our witness for being here today. My first question follows up on the earlier questions. If we were to include, say, entity in the definition, would that add any sort of clarification? Would it meet the OECD's, for example, definition standards? So what are you talking about, as an organization or a business? Well, under Rule 8, perhaps rather than saying an individual, we could say an entity. Perhaps that would expand the definition, and that was actually a recommendation of the Commissioner, that we extend the definition, but not just to an individual, but also to an entity. Well, if I've understood you correctly, in the Lobbying Act, there are lobbyists who work for, say, NGOs and who work for corporations, and the Code of Conduct applies to both. I see. So I don't really know if it's necessary then to make that distinction in the definition, because it does apply to both. You can have an individual working for an organization who undertakes lobbying, and if they're doing that on behalf of the organization, then that's what they're doing. I was just wondering if it would help clarify the differences between, or the discrepancies rather, between both statutes. Well, I don't know if that would be necessarily a good definition. We have a code of conduct for lobbyists, and that's not a statute. It's a part of the system, but it's written by the Commissioner. Yes, perhaps I didn't really put my question very clearly. I think I'm going to move on to the next one. The previous witness we heard in this committee said that from their point of view, often there was shopping, perhaps shopping for the best definition or shopping for the best statute, because there are gray areas. And so they would basically look for the statute that suited them best. So would there be a way, other than updating the definitions or making them more consistent, that you might want to work on in order to avoid that phenomena of shopping, grocery shopping? Well, I don't really understand why they say someone can just go shopping for the best one, because the statutes are clear. If you're a public office holder, a designated public office holder, here are the prohibitions under the Lobbying Act. The definitions are there for public office holders and for reporting public office holders. Now, for reporting public officers, there are prohibitions after their employment. That is for 2 years. So the restrictions apply for 2 years after their employment. And there is a 5-year prohibition under the Lobbying Act. However, it applies to, I think what I'm referring to is an individual who couldn't do something under the Conflict Interest Act but may go shopping for another act. I think I'll move on to the next question now. The Commissioner suggested that the Conflict of Interest Act and the Code of Conduct for MPs be harmonized. So I'd like to know what you're doing in your office in those terms. And would there be anything you would suggest be changed for the purposes of consistency and harmonization between the Conflict of Interest Act, the Lobbying Act, and the Codes of Conduct? Well, my responsibility is for lobbyists. Yes, I understand. However, there are different definitions. So let's say we put the code in the legislation. Are there any definitions that would have to be modified for the purposes of consistency? Well, for designated public office holders, you may have more people who are involved than for reporting public office holders. So you really have to decide who you want to be able to include in the definition and why. Thank you. Mr. Mays, you now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Conditions. You know, a person that when you're recruiting somebody for as a public office holder, whether it be in a ministry or another position, you know, do you think that maybe we're compromising the ability to get qualified professional people because there's that restriction? Because if they leave their employment, it's going to restrict their ability to use their knowledge base that they have and to help a organization, because that's their value. Their value is in the fact that they have insights and they have a particular expertise in maybe in a particular ministry. And part of that is, you know, is the value of the office holders as far as a knowledge resource for both private and public administrations or interests. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts about that. Was there a problem in the past that this definitely had to be put in place, or is it just a perceived problem? And I'm wondering whether it really is necessary.
In terms of putting a post-employment provision into the Act, well, I think, as I understand it, with the Federal Accountability Act, that was one of the things that was looked at, was this whole revolving door issue. And to avoid having someone who was in some of these high-level decisions being able to leave office and to use the advantages they had gained through contacts and knowledge for a period of 5 years upon leaving office. And I mean, what I can say is that, you know, what the 5-year prohibition on lobbying activities under the Lobbying Act prohibits them from lobbying, but it doesn't prevent, you know, in terms of communicating with the public office on their ritual activity, but it doesn't stop them from earning a living. I mean, they can, you know, they are doing other jobs or going into government relations firms. Some of them, as we've discussed, that are going into, can go and work for a corporation as long as lobbying constitutes less than a significant part of their individual duties. So it isn't prohibiting, it might be, you know, limiting them wanting to do certain jobs, but it's not prohibiting them from gaining employment upon leaving office.
One of the witnesses we had before talked about clear rules, and Mr. Angus talked about fair rules, and fair and clear sometimes are not necessarily the same. And as far as clear rules, do you think that we would have the ability to put in place rules that were clear enough to cover all the bases? And are we not better off to be in some ways a little more general, so that I like the idea that as long as there's a real or apparent interest and that has maybe connected to a financial gain of some sort. What is your feeling about trying to identify all the areas of conflict of interest?
It's a fairly big task. I mean, I think you're right. There's a number of activities, but it's in looking at situations, and this again is why I sort of look at some of the broad definitions is because it's what would a reasonable person say in seeing a situation. So, you know, and I think that's where the court decision came in. So the individual who was actively working on the fundraising campaign and then lobbying the department or the minister in question would say there's you know, a reasonable issue here that maybe there's an apparent conflict. It doesn't mean that there's a real conflict. I mean, the thing with the real conflict is it's a demonstrated interference, which is what I think the court in March 2009 came out was saying that, you know, if you just look at real, the bar's too high. So there is something in terms of looking at apparent conflict of interest as well.
You know, Mr. Calkins talked about this earlier, but is the value or the threshold of gifts, and it's at $200, and there's a suggestion by the Commissioner to lower that to $30. And I just want to give you an example of a lobby group and a public office holder that how this can be a really challenge, and that is the Dairy Association, Canadian Dairy Association. They always have their meetings here in Ottawa. They invite MPs to join them for dinner, and at the Chateau, it's not cheap. Definitely misses even the $200 threshold, I would venture to say. And yet, you know, they're an organization, so I feel that they're lobbyists. They're getting paid indirectly as directors by the cost of those trips here and whatnot. And yet, it would not be reasonable for me to not be there as a person that has dairy farmers in my area. But there isn't a time that goes by that I sit with them, they don't talk about supply management.
Right.
So now, this is a difficulty that I'm having is, you know, I think they have a right to express their views. I don't think that the dinner that I enjoy with them and the time is unduly challenging my decision making. Those are the kind of things that when we put rules in place, it is very difficult to, you know, really, is it going to put restrictions on accessibility and free dialogue with constituents or organizations that have particular issues that they want to bring forward to their elected representative?
I mean, lobbying, as I've said in the past, is a legitimate activity. And I think we've talked about the fact that we don't want, or I've said, and I think it was said in committee as well today, that you don't want government and decision-makers operating in a vacuum. That said, it's sort of like the, you know, does the lobbying and the communicating have to, as you say, occur over a really nice dinner? And what some lobbyists have said to me is that public office holders are paying for those dinners so that there is no sort of gift or conflict. So you're still at the dinner, but the lobbyist, you know, if I was looking at it, isn't placing you in a conflict, or it'd be more difficult because they're properly, you know, registered. They would have to register that encounter if they lobbied you during that particular dinner. The issue is, you know, by giving the gift of the ticket, and that's something I'd have to, you know, look at the case, is are they placing, you know, are they creating an apparent conflict of interest, let alone a real conflict?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Donc, je vous remercie.
Your time is up, and I'd now like to thank our witnesses from the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying for having come today and answered our questions. We will be meeting again next Wednesday under this study, and we will also be looking at a draft report. So I'd like to thank you once again for coming today, and we will now adjourn until next Wednesday. Thank you.